we live?
Yes.
Live in the universe, live in the world. Hey, welcome. Thank you for coming. I know how hard it is to fit into your very, very, very busy schedules. Hope you get a lot out of this afternoon. 2 hours.
All right, so I'll have to speak a little bit more quietly now, otherwise we'll get feedback. We'll start vibrating too much. So as I said, a very important theoretical intellectual perspective we're going to discuss this afternoon in the new materialisms. How exactly you apply it, what you do with it, well, that, you know, that's obviously up to you and your particular projects, what you're looking at. You know, I work in education, but clearly, obviously, it's open to many other applications, many other social fields. I think that the social does still exist and work, you know, despite Bruno Latour and others denying this. And I really do believe that the new materialisms is a way into an understanding how we can try and work differently in this space. Okay, so my brief introduction over and done with. Peta's just got here through trial and tribulation, and she's just going to talk to her presentation today, okay? Do I need to pass this on to you? Lots of technical bits and pieces, which hopefully we will not mess up.
All right, let's see how this goes. I'm going to, excuse me, speak from here in any case, even though I don't have slides, so just give me a moment, please. As I was saying to Nick, I've actually never had slides, so it's a different mode of engagement. And I've got quite a bit of text, which I'll be speaking to some of these points as well. So my own work, as my sort of brief bio indicates, is positioned, I do feminist politics, one could say, most generally, and I came to new materialism via that channel, a big interest in what's going on with the nature-culture debates in feminist thought. And new materialism came as up for me as a continuation of a lot of very important feminist questions. I'm rooted in sociology. I did my honours and my PhD in sociology, so we could say that the force of the questions that I ask in and around the new materialisms are very much of a social nature. They're engaging with questions of inequality, social justice, and so on. And of course, they're inspired by the sorts of distinctions or the questions of sociological analysis that I was introduced to so many years ago with that training, questions of micro-macro agency structure and so on. So these are the threads of my discussion, or at least the focus when it comes to doing new materialist work. A lot of the work I do is quite, we could say it's theoretical engagements at this point. So unlike Nick, I'm not going to have something that's a specific project or study I'm working on now. I do a lot of the sort of groundwork, thinking inside new materialisms, with its approach to how are we going to talk about the political? How are we going to talk about community? How are we going to talk about change with these different sort of flavours of materialist thought now on the table? Just as a sort of introduction today, obviously we are very much interested in a question of class within new materialist thought. I'm not getting to that directly. I get to it sort of by the by as part of the discussion I'm having here. So it's a bit of an indirect route, one could say. But that question of where is the place of class in new materialism is a very important one. And as Nick pointed out when we were discussing this, still quite absent. So we are intending to broach precisely that absence today, mine being more of a sort of working through the theoretical considerations ahead of Nick's intervention. Okay, so I might as well just get started and stuck into it. When we're talking to the new materialisms, I'm not sure what the general register with the new materialisms is amongst the audience today, or people participating in the seminar today. It might have some confused, especially when we're saying we're doing social analysis. It's in many ways it's positioned itself after the work of post-structuralism. It's variously called material feminisms, the material turn. It's not a gesture towards materialisms of old. They're generally considered to be askance with historical materialist and critical realist positions. That's the general tenor we have in the literature, but I want to say that perhaps these considerations, the structural concerns, the ability to speak to the sort of conditions and production of certain forms of inequality in terms of class and capacity are there and available in the new materialist discussion. And so that is the general trajectory of my paper today. I want to suggest where and how that is possible. And I hope to have done it. This is my preliminary step into this side of the discussion. So I hope to have done it convincingly enough, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback and questions on the sort of the directions I'm trying to take. What's at stake in a lot of these discussions, and the way that people will differentiate between the materialisms of old and new is the way that they position ontology. So the ontological concerns are different, and that's where the points of contention start to sort of condense. So what's at stake is how can we account for systems of power and inequality through a new materialist toolkit? In spite of what we know or don't know about the new materialisms, they've arrived on the scene of cultural analysis and methodological innovation with some force in recent years. The critical response has been mixed and somewhat regional. Nevertheless, what labours in the name of this analysis has proliferated, and for its own clear reasons. Mostly this is because of its challenge to mechanistic notions of materiality as inert substance and resource, prone to human culture's instrumental demands. In the often quoted words of Diana Coole and Samantha Frost, new materialism calls for, quote, new ways of thinking about matter and processes of materialisation, made possible by a staunch adherence to non-binary formulations of nature and culture that uncover matter's, quote, immanent vitality. And it's an ontological dynamism that is underscored here. It makes materiality, quote, always something more than mere matter, an excess, force, vitality, relationality, or difference that renders matter active, self-creative, productive, unpredictable, end quote. Any cursory look at the literature will show that the roads to new materialist analyses are many, and they are seeded in different philosophical, generally speaking, trajectories and disciplinary programs. But the concerns of this field are strongly driven by existing debates, say, that have come through feminism, as I mentioned, and with an interest in the political potential of materiality. So the difference is that where much social analysis has been largely concerned to draw the political circumference around human bodies, new materialist approaches tend to expand this circumference to include what is often called the more than human of non-human bodies, objects, materials, geographies, even geologies, at the same time that they query the autonomy of human identity. In proposing a significantly broadened ontology, conventional notions of agency are shifted, and the sovereignty of the human subject, with its role in shaping social and global processes, is shown to be contingent. Its identity and status is found to be entirely entangled in its relations with others, be they animals, technologies, environments, and other forms of organic and inorganic life. As sociologists, a field of inquiry that deals also with non-human activity may already confront some with its lack of familiarity. Jane Bennett's notion of vibrant materiality, another one of those, vibrant matter, sorry, another one of the big concept terms within the new materialisms. This is a case in point. Here we find a notion of political ecology, assemblages of human and non-human actors and actants that can even include waste. With the human understood to be part of a circulating economy of material things, its sovereign status, along with any mechanistic fantasies of utility and control, have to be relinquished, helping us to arrive at, this is to quote Bennett, more materially sustainable modes of production and consumption. End quote. There are problems with Bennett's argument. I don't have space for them today. More importantly, or most importantly, it's her intended departure from the anthropocentric politics, from an anthropocentric politics, that claims our attention. And this is achieved with an understanding of materiality, which now resembles something of the signature of new materialist intervention. It is emergent and generative. A sense of material agency that exceeds the privileged capacities for action and intention accorded most human subjects. And what this approach lays emphasis on, then, is the relational, indeterminate, and inventive nature of matter. And I'm underlining that or repeating it a little bit here because that really is the crux of where the contentions with new materialist approaches to materiality or matter take their aim, start to come in hard. So, this understanding of matter, this is sort of what constitutes as what makes new materialism unique, or what is its contribution in contemporary social and cultural analysis. It does have clear bearing for contemporary inquiry, for example, in feminist discussions, if I could keep the focus there. As Cecilia Alsberg and her colleagues point out, it extends upon and diversifies the, quote, the already age-old feminist question of who gets to count as human within the annals of the humanities, end quote. While it fundamentally threatens the humanist logics of gender and race, sexuality and species that ground our research and inquiry. That's also to quote from Alsberg and her colleagues. Lena Gunnarsson adds that it carries an important reminder that nature is not feminism's enemy. In a nutshell, it opens up the biologism that was rooted in post-structuralist feminist discussions. At the same time, it makes an idea of matter available to current feminist projects without the fear of biologism being re-invoked. As Bennett has made clear for us, a new materialist ontology can work to deregulate or dismantle hierarchies, pushing for a more ecological understanding of political systems as a set of relations that far exceeds economy in its more restricted sense. Diana Kuhl, a political scientist who works in international relations at Birkbeck, suggests that economy in new materialist terms is expanded to something like material flows across different tiers of the social natural ecosphere. And I'm quoting Kuhl here, it tries to appreciate their feedback loops as they give rise to the lived parameters of ordinary lives, end quote. This approach understands matter in a more straightforward sense as, and again I'm quoting from Kuhl, the actual sensuous corporeal milieu of everyday survival as commodities and consumer durables, the hardwiring and the detritus of the cityscape, the vegetative landscape of wet and green stuff. End quote. But it also understands matter or materiality as materialization, quote, tracing politico-economic, geopolitical and biophysical circuits, conduits and networks through which matter passes as it is transformed, given surplus value, degraded, rerouted, hoarded and so on, end quote. Not only does new materialism carry implications, quote, for some of the social sciences' most cherished concepts and assumptions, but also, more generally, as a political, ethical intervention within the material unfolding of the 21st century, Kuhl contends. Now, these accommodations around how we're going to think about the materiality of new materialism, or how we are thinking about new materialist ontologies, these accommodations notwithstanding, a question posed to Elizabeth Wilson, whose work is synonymous with new materialist concerns, in an interview with Feminist Theory, published in 2011, this question that was posed to her imparts some of the scepticism attending such the new materialist ambitions concerning matter. When she was asked, does focusing on the non-human mean leaving women/gender/sex outside the central frame of feminism? In other words, how confused are we allowed to become about the proper objects of political inquiry? For Sara Ahmed, a tendency to get beyond categories like gender and race in new materialist theorisations presents the harder challenge that, quote, in giving up these terms, we give up more than the terms. We give up on a certain kind of intervention into the world, end quote. What's at stake here for Ahmed and for others is the political capacities of these new materialist ontologies, which are generally thought to sidestep questions of specificity or to be inadequate to the task of providing real agendas for social change. The general tone of these critiques is that new materialist approaches generalise matter to the point of their being unable to give a robust enough account of how social and political differences, the specificities of lived experience and material conditions, how these occur or how they might be changed. It differentiates post-humanist concerns from that of materialist and post-colonial feminism, according to Sari Erni. So although we're prompted by new materialists to sustain our attention to issues, quote, about women, power, sexuality, racialisation, the material effects and affects of power asymmetries and social antagonisms are made out to be traditional and not so inspiring. In their essay, Politics That Matter, Thinking About Power and Justice with the New Materialisms, published as part of a special issue on the politics of new materialism, Washik et al. Continue in this critical vein by saying, and I'll quote the full sentence, we suggest that this emphasis on the mutual constitution of entangled agencies, Barrad's definition of interaction, can make it difficult to identify the systematic reproduction of inequalities. Otherwise put, our concern is that the new terms of agency make it difficult to name and so hold in view the continuities, durabilities, and often monotonous predictabilities that characterise systems of power asymmetry, such as capitalism, patriarchy, racism. End quote. Lena Gunnarsson, who I mentioned before, she's based in Örebro University in Sweden. She provides a particularly compelling argument that takes this claim further, takes Washik et al.'s claim further. So while she's sympathetic to the efforts of the naturalistic term, as she prefers to call it, she regards the move to foreground matter's inherent dynamism to involve, quote, a glorification of the indeterminate and unbounded that leads to a one-sided conceptualisation of nature in which its constraining dimensions are overlooked. End quote. Her antagonist in her argument is the claims of renowned philosopher Elizabeth Grosz, who has contributed much to the feminist tradition of engaging with matter and nature. In Grosz's hands, according to Gunnarsson, change is both universalised and trivialised, as her view of matter, quote, offers no way of distinguishing between the dynamism that is constitutive of life and the kind of change that would bring about a better world, end quote. Indeed, these distinctions need to be overlooked for the sake of a feminist intervention, which aspires to, hang on, I've just lost my place, which aspires for change in quite specific terms, change of a certain emancipatory kind, says Gunnarsson. To glean the problem, one need only ask of this approach, as Gunnarsson does, what happens if matter's sui generis or self-organising capacities don't materialise in our hoped-for directions? The unruliness that's endorsed by Grosz and other new materialists, she argues, makes them pay very little attention to the specificities of human freedom and political change. And to this she offers a directive or perhaps a reparative, namely that, quote, a truly feminist concern with nature ought to focus not so much on nature as such, but on how we might better understand the conditions for changing human life in light of its basis in nature, end quote. Now, there's a fair bit that's wrong with that claim or that direction that she's trying to take. In particular, she seems to be working from the basis of a pre-existing notion of human society and the political, So in some ways, diagnosis might be rooted in certain an inability to open up the very categories of the social, the political, and so on that we're being invited to do with new materialist analysis, but which can be quite difficult to do in view of our existing disciplinary loyalties. But instead of taking up with the potential limitations of her argument, I'm going to turn in a different direction here to go against the grain of Gunnarsson and others' contentions by suggesting that a new materialist ontology does indeed provide a way to address the specificity of inequality without forfeiting structural analysis or systemic attentions. If we turn to the work of Karen Barad, who is possibly the most widely cited scholar in the new materialist canon, then we can look at the claims about materiality that we've so far encountered in a little bit more detail and to make this argument. Both a social theorist and a quantum physicist, Barad describes her own approach as one of a relational ontology, and she makes clear what this emphasis on relation involves when she takes up with Niels Bohr's understanding of ontological indeterminacy. So the thread here again is indeterminacy, and now I'm going straight to Karen Barad's argument in my most summarised, hopefully accessible way, because it really do change gears quite quickly when we start to talk about the history of quantum physics. Just to give you an idea of what her claims around indeterminacy are actually rooted in. So this is a new materialist notion and a very influential notion of matter, materiality. So if there's one distinction that captures it best, that understanding of ontological indeterminacy that Barad works with, it can be found in her comparison of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and Bohr's notion of complementarity. One of the most surprising discoveries in quantum experimentation was the way in which the behaviour of matter under observation changed according to the type of experimental apparatus being used in its measurement, and therefore also the concepts guiding the experiment. In other words, how a particle performs is contingent on the specific material arrangement being used to measure its performance, including the processes of observation. For Heisenberg, this indicated that the observer cannot know the behaviour or position of matter prior to experimentation. For Bohr, the stakes were much higher. What he surmised is that the nature of matter is itself indeterminate and dynamically contingent. The very nature of phenomena changes with corresponding changes in the apparatus, to quote Barad, which means that matter does not have inherent or fixed attributes. There are no pre-measurable properties of matter that precede their experimentation. In her account of the electron's strange tendency to materialise according to the apparatus through which it's being measured, Barad takes Bohr's argument for ontological indeterminacy to rethink the nature of the measuring apparatus as a primary entanglement of material objects, conceptual definitions, the observer, and the measuring apparatus itself. Differences between one thing and another are not given. Entities and terms don't pre-exist their relations. Rather, they're produced intra-actively. That's the term that keeps coming up in new materialist literature, and I think it's one that's bandied around a lot by people who are still confusing it with the notion of interaction, which is two things coming together. Intra-active means co-constituting, boundary making it the process of becoming different from, but it's an entirely entangled process. So that idea of intra-actions is the one that she is underscoring from Bohr's understanding of complementarity, or how we might approach ontological indeterminacy. So, as I was saying, entities and terms don't pre-exist their relation, rather they're produced intra-actively. Apparatuses, then, are not simply technologies of inquiry in the narrow sense. They're, quote, the practices through which divisions are constituted, end quote. And these can't be understood as specifically human practices because human identity does not pre-exist the apparatus. And these practices don't produce finite ends. Rather, all differences are, quote, local resolutions. Something gains its coherence but always remains open-ended because what resolves itself as an identity is entangled with, that is, it both includes and excludes anything it might be conventionally defined against. And I'm just going to repeat that because that's really getting at the heart of an argument, new materialist argument for materiality or matter, that I think has these profound implications for how we can then speak to questions of specificity and inequality. A primary entanglement. Whenever somebody is involved in that, let's just use the case of the the apparatus of measurement, and this is the two-slit experiment that she's actually speaking to and goes into some detail, quite a lot of detail. So obviously that doesn't come in, and we're not physicists here in that sense. I just need to sort of underscore the point that she's trying to make around matter's indeterminacy. Entities and terms don't pre-exist their relation. They're produced intraactively. Apparatuses aren't just measuring apparatuses in that restricted sense. They are practices through which divisions are constituted. And they can't just be understood as human practices, because human identity is not something that is atomistic, soul alone, and pre-existing anything that it engages with, that it is in interaction with, that is relating to. It is just as much a part of, entangled in, what those differences are, what becomes of say we're going to go straight to the example of the scientist doing that two-slit experiment. The observer, the apparatus, measuring apparatus, what is observed, the ideas, the concepts that are guiding that, and then have to be materially adjusted within the apparatus itself. And then what you're able to say about matter, or in this case, photon, an electron, through that experimentation process. That she would call phenomena, and it's not a whole lot of things coming together in interaction. It is the very sight or spatializing becoming of difference of human observer and every other part, we could call it. So it's quite a profound kind of statement to make about what materializing is. Differentiating is another way of putting it, or differentializing is another way of putting it. It's a lot to wrap our head around, as I've just written at the head of this next paragraph. It's a lot to wrap our head around, but what starts to become clear is that this understanding of the apparatus undermines our taken for granted assumptions about matter and its presumed separation from conceptual as well as observational practices. What we find instead is that, and I quote Barrett, matter is always opening, heterogeneous, non-contemporaneous with itself. Matter is always shifting, reconfiguring, redifferentiating itself. This, we could say, is Barrad's definition of material agency. The differential articulation of the world in its, she says, extraordinary liveliness. In a way, then, the apparatus could be our shorthand for the nature of reality, but not a static reality, reality in its becoming. Now, this differs from Gunnarsson's account in a significant way, in that indeterminacy here is not simply an anything goes scenario. Matter's indeterminacy has as much to do with what becomes determined or determinable, but nothing becomes determined in a final or fixed sense. She speaks of the local resolution. Specificity in this sense is a local resolution, but it's also dynamic, changing. Now, obviously the pervading question is what matters, and how is this understanding of matter as materialization entangled with power relations? How can we speak about the production of inequalities in these terms, and indeed pay homage to the structures that normalise, stabilise and constitute enduring social inequalities? The analysis Barrett provides of political theorist Leela Fernandez's study of capital, gender and class at work on the shop floor of a Calcutta jute mill helps us to realise this side of the discussion. It offers a new materialist understanding of stratification and inequality that draws on a notion of performativity as a materialising of political economies of class and gender, and pointing the way to a macro analysis that many claim is missing in new materialist ontologies. Barrett draws heavily from, not draws heavily, but she uses one text, the one text of Fernandez where this case study is explored, examined. It's her text Producing Workers, published in 1997. And in this, Fernandez is meshing analytical tools from post-structuralism, notably Foucault, and Marxism, to obtain an understanding of the multiple technologies through which the working class is produced. The substance for these analyses takes the form of her examination of shop floor dynamics as they materialise, to quote Barrett now, in the course of the everyday lives of the workers. In this environment, sewing machines, weaving machines, and other textile machinery line the factory floors, cramped together with workers from many levels, manager, union staff, male and female workers in that one space, engaging, as we could say, an entanglement of the machinic, the bodily, as well as what we might say the more ideological forces are working within that space. For Fernandez, the notion of production is being changed here and being thought through in terms of a spatialisation or materialisation within and of that space through those engagements of all the, we could say, actors, participants on the shop floor. But one that is lively and alive and continually changing and able to shift what we could say are just the taken for granted or the expected logics of dominance or of power that are taking place so that we would expect to see at work in a run-of-the-mill jute mill in Calcutta. She looks to the way that the workers are positioned next to each other, how the machines obscure the view of the managers in various parts of the work floor, so that the workers are in fact emboldened, allowed to run discussions in amongst themselves that might exceed what it is that the idea of production or the ideas of control that the managers and obviously those who are gaining from the mill operations are actually obtaining there. When the machine breaks down, there is a question about machinic agency as it can relate into the practices, what happens for the day when something breaks down, and how this disorganises and then reorganises all of those labour relations that take place in that day, in that particular line, on that particular day. She speaks to the way that people are organised on that shop floor according to gender and class distinctions, and how certain groups will not speak with other groups, or how certain groups are thrown into, you could say arbitrarily, but they're not, thrown into engagements with each other that otherwise would not have occurred. And in all of this, Fernandez underscores the fact that we are looking at the classed and gendered production of that labour that is not excluding any question of capital, that is definitely including structural issues, or what we might say is a structural analysis, but probably not in the terms that we're accustomed to saying structural analysis involves. This is the very embodiment and transformation, the materialising of class and gender in these relations with and between humans and non-humans. And what is a very, very traditional, conventional ethnographic study of the jute mill. And this is the way that Barad is reading it to really underscore where it is that power is in itself a materialising effect and affect of these entangled engagements in this one space. And I actually really like this case study because it gives me some, I don't know, we don't have to sit at the sort of cutting edge of what it is that we should be talking about in terms of contemporary social issues, social justice, or even technologies, that we can go to what we'd say are most staid, traditional, boring spaces, maybe familiar spaces, and in fact find our way towards an understanding of the materialising, spatialising, materialising of those contexts that can speak to this new materialist notion of materiality that is at once also offering us up some form of structural or macro analysis. So if we could sort of summarise it in Barad's terms, the material conditions of the shop floor performatively produce relations of class and other forms of cultural identity in the interaction of humans and machines. It's understanding class as a dynamic variable with integral cultural, ideological and discursive dimensions. This does not diminish, indeed it is necessary to, a thoroughgoing analysis of economic capital in its materiality. I've just got some concluding comments from this, because I'm sort of, this is where I got to in my thinking with these questions, and it's sort of hovering right there in front of me. And so I'm not going to take, at this point I haven't taken that thread of how I can then explore class or speak to class in a more applied sense. I think Nick's doing more of that today. It's part of his, the focus of his presentation. I wanted to just reflect for a moment on what this means, what it means when we start making claims for material agency in these new materialist terms. Because as I could suggest, very briefly suggested with an idea of structure, there's something about the political is clearly being held up to the light here. It disturbs the capacity for politics to appeal to an apparent and given reality, as though this were ever separable from the forms of intervention it demands. It plays havoc with the coordinates of identity to the point where any political referent is thrown into disarray. And what this means is that it's difficult to name or locate a proper object or subject of political life. So on this new materialist reading, we can't easily reify the concept of politics, nor its objects and processes. Nor can we reduce it to forms of political action and decision-making on the part of particular kinds of subjects or institutions involved in such political efforts. Instead, it forces us to turn our attention to what I think is a bigger challenge: how we're going to understand the specificity of identity, relation and action in already political and nothing less than substantive terms. Contra Gunnarsson's concerns, what we seem to have is an approach that potentially gives account of the possibility for the materialisation, a material realisation of all identity as the very process of socio-political organisation, including those constraints, including the less palatable idea of how are we going to have a material account of inequality in its becoming. It seems to conflate the what ought to be of politics with the what is of being or becoming, and I think to important effect. As Barrad's case study illustrates for us, or as this discussion through Barrad's work in particular illustrates for us, questions of capital and class are not off the table for new materialist analysis. And so in a way we can ask, what do we mean when we say something is missing? What are we attaching to that notion or idea of class? If we're going to say it's missing, it's not to say it be incorrect that something's missing, but it is to ask us to open up that apparatus of analysis to think, what do we mean? The political, in Diana Cool's terms, just to shift back to her, the political implications of a new materialist ontology offer up a renewed critical theory that in principle allows agentic capacities to be found in both subjects and structures. And just to finish on her comment, lest this might appear as too radical a move from the standpoint of political analysis, it is germane to point out that it does not preclude an identification with agents who might manifest their capacities in ways which have strong affinity with conventional accounts. It is merely that their emergence has to be traced and not presumed, which will likely result in their capabilities for agency being recognised as more partial, contextual and provisional than liberal humanism, individual agency, Marxism, class agency, or international relations, state agency, or realist approaches allow. Thank you. Should I just pass this straight over to Nick? I thought we were doing questions towards the end. Yeah. Okay. I don't know, I can't remember what. Nick? Sorry, I'm a little bit confused. I guess we could take a question if there's any comments, but maybe just to write them.
Okay, so our second speaker today, Nick Fox. She actually met Nick Fox in 1995. I realised the other day we organised it at the University of Warwick, and we did a postgraduate. I hate these things. We did a postgraduate conference called Virtual Futures, and Nick was a presenter, believe it or not. So it just shows you how these things can come back to haunt you after all these many years. So Nick suggested this seminar on this, I think, very important topic of new materialisms. Nick is a professor at University of Huddersfield, lovely place, Huddersfield, north of England, and an honorary professor in Sheffield. Researches and widely quoted in the new materialist post-human field of social theory, and applies it to various areas such as sexualities, health, environment, creativity, emotions, etc. Okay, so Nick, take it away. Hopefully the technology is working.
Thank you, David. The reason that the technology is so complicated is because we're doing this live on the internet as we speak. We're also recording this, which is why you had 4 people at the front who are actually trying to sort out all the complexity of that. Thanks so much to Peter for doing, in a sense, doing the hard yards. I always start with these things by saying I'm not a philosopher, and I'm a jobbing sociologist who has spent 30 years trying to get to grips with the realities that we see all around us. And for me, new materialisms and post-humanism offer opportunities to actually address the real pressing social issues which surround us. And it feels a bit as if over the last 10 years or so, I've been ticking off different aspects of sociology. And with my co-author, Pam Aldred, from Brunel University, London, we started off with sexualities, and we've looked at research methods, and in the book that we wrote together, then we talked about creativity, about emotions, about health. So now it's time for class. So today, we finally get round to an issue which is so central to sociology, and for the last 150 years, people have been concerning themselves with it. So it's a bit of a change of tempo, I think, probably from Peter's talk, which really gave us such a useful background for understanding some of the issues around social divisions and social inequalities from a materialist perspective. What I'm going to do is try to bring to bear some of those ideas to actually start to unpack how we might move forward with thinking about social class from the perspective of sociology and related disciplines. I think I've come to the conclusion, having now got a draft of a paper that I hope soon will submit for publication, and this is actually the first outing for this very new work on social class and new materialism. I think I've come to the conclusion, having written now 8,000 words about it with Pam, that probably sociology has been on the wrong track entirely for the last 150 years with the idea of social class. So what I'm going to do in the next half hour is have a go and tell you why I've come to that conclusion and suggest some ways forward. So what I'm going to do is to pick up on a critical materialist exploration of social class division and stratification, and actually recognizing that Marxism came the closest to actually understand a materiality of class in terms of understanding the relationality between, on one hand, human bodies very much material entities, and also then the materiality of capital, of the resources and the means of production with which human bodies and human labor interact. So moving beyond historical materialism of Marx to the new materialism, and I'm going to identify 3 criticisms of contemporary sociological analyses of social class. And then I'm going to address each of those criticisms in turn by establishing a relational, a new materialist, and micro-political ontology of social divisions. And then I'm going to devote quite a lot of time to looking at an illustration, which I'm going to take for that a classic piece of work in sociology, a book which some of you, if you are in the field of sociology or education, will know quite well, by a gentleman called Paul Willis, who wrote an ethnographic study of school students back in 1977 called Learning to Labour. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reanalyze his data from this new materials perspective and make some conclusions on the basis of that about how new materialism rethinks social class and requires us to rethink that for sociological theory and empirical research. At which point I press the button for the PowerPoint to move forward and nothing happens. Okay. So that's the basic structure of the talk set out there. So let's think very quickly about how sociology has addressed social class. And we can divide it up really into 3 main threads. The first of those is the neo-Marxist thread. And as I mentioned a moment ago, what Marx did was address class based around economic production in capitalist societies. And he differentiated between a bourgeoisie that owned and deployed the means of production, for example, tools, factories, property, raw materials, and then a proletariat that sold its labor power in order to add value to those capital resources. And neo-Marxists, since Marx, have basically been seeking to take that 2-class system and refine it to cope with all the anomalies that don't really fit into it. What is the position of students? What are the positions of managers? What is the position of the self-employed and such like? So people like Wright have devoted their life to actually doing that work of revising Marx. The second thread is neo-Weberian, and while Weber acknowledged Marx's focus on ownership of capital and market relations, he explored the complex interactions between power, life choices, and social mobility, and arguing that that produced a range of different classes and differentiated middle class, working class, self-employed. And we can see descendants of that Weberian multi-class heritage in manifestations such as those class scales, which you probably have seen, where you divide people up into 5 or is it 7 classes, with professionals at the top, and then management, and then things like skilled workers, semi-skilled workers, unskilled workers, and non-employed. So that is the way to try to provide a clearer classification within that neo-Weberian view. Well, over the last 20 years or so, probably most of you will be most familiar with the kind of class analysis which has emerged from the work of Pierre Bourdieu. And although there is a kind of feeling of neo-Weberianism within it, it's different in the sense that rather than being deductive analysis of societies in terms of a number of different classes, what Bourdieu did was he, through ethnographic work and very, very detailed analysis of statistics, to try to produce an inductive understanding of class. And for those of you who've read Bourdieu, and I can't admit that I've read every single word of his huge tomes, a distinction, and his work on academic life, which are that thick, then you will be aware of the detail which Bourdieu has gone into. But my criticism is that Bourdieu emphasizes the symbolic. He argues that in addition to the economic capital that Marx talked about, that I mentioned a moment ago, it was very important to understand symbolic resources, which he calls things like social capital and cultural capital. Then they're comprising the social networks which people have, and also the significance of different things such as opera or Dance with the Stars, or all those popular culture things that might actually just define oneself in relationship to other people. So for Bourdieu, it's the specific volume and combination of capitals, of social, cultural, economic capital, which an individual possesses, which establishes the dispositions or the habitus that orientate individuals towards particular ways of thinking, and hence their class position. And we've seen recently a lot of adaptations of that Bourdieusian approach in more populist analyses of class. In the UK, then there was the so-called Great British Class Survey, which was a massive online survey, which people, a team led by Mike Savage, actually used to develop a picture of the modern state of class in the UK, and I think it's been conducted in other countries as well. And you get things like an elite class, you get what he calls emergent service workers, a technical middle class, and also a precariat of people whose work is extremely insecure. Well, like I say, Peter's done the hard yards in terms of thinking about new materialism. So I'm going to really gloss over this aspect, and if you can hold in mind what Peter was talking about, which was actually setting a perspective on new materialisms, I just want to pick up a few points about how new materialist theory actually rethinks the sociological landscape. Firstly, to say that it is not a return to historical materialism. In no way is it that. Instead, what it does is that it recognizes a wide range of material forces which produce the world and everything within it. And actually, that range of materiality cuts across those things which we have thought about traditionally as the natural world, and those things which we have thought about as the social world. Actually, interestingly, people have pointed out, for example, Tompkins has pointed out that this is, in a sense, bringing in some non-Western ontologies, the kinds of ontologies which have been thought about by indigenous peoples here in Australia, in Canada, in other parts of the world for millennia. And actually, that distinction of culture and nature, or mind and matter, is something which is very specifically Eurocentric and has emerged out of that particular European ontology. So in a sense, it's kind of shifting back to some earlier ontologies. But that has some significant implications. As Peter said, in the new materialist view, materiality is here, it says plural, complex, relational, and emergent. This is all of those things. It cuts across that nature-culture divide, and so what it does is it rejects the distinction between, on one hand, the physical world of these things and the idea and the ideas of and the meanings and desires, the imaginations, all the things which go on inside human heads. And what it opens up is a possibility to explain the interaction between those material things and those thoughts and memories and imaginations and desires. It allows us to recognize also the agency of the non-human, whereas sociology has devoted itself for much of its career to thinking about the agency of humans as being somehow special and privileged. It actually moves to recognition that a tool or technology or a building or the internet can actually be social agents making things happen, and that vitality of matter that Peter talks about. This extends massively the scope of analysis beyond those concerns with structural forces, which those people who have been interested in stratifications of class, race, gender, sexuality and such like have tended to focus upon, and moving beyond structural and macro level social phenomena. And the wonderful paper by Van der Toyen and Dolphine on the transversality of the new materialisms is a must-read for those of you who haven't read it on that. But there is no other level of social organization. That means we really have to focus in on events. We have to understand that the social world is produced through a myriad ongoing series of events. An event, you know, there was an event half an hour ago when Peter stood up. There was another event when she was speaking. There was another event when David was speaking. There's another event now when I'm speaking. And what we are doing is we're continually producing the social world through our activities. There are no structures and systems and mechanisms which somehow are making things happen from on high or from underneath. It's actually here we are producing the world from minute to minute. And we have to acknowledge that endless cascade of events. That has huge significance, this ontology, because what it means is that we are not fixed, stable entities. There are not fixed, stable entities which are things like a university or an economic system. They are things which are continually being produced and reproduced from events, from the activities which we as human beings engaging with materialities actually are producing. And we have to understand that it is not just humans, but also the material world and the interactions between them, or the interactions between them, which are actually producing that. Agency is no longer privileged to human action. It is affect, it is a capacity to affect and be affected, which is of significance here, and that's a feature of all matter, human and non-human, animate and inanimate. Well, that has huge implications for our research methodology as well, and that will be reflected in the rest of what I say this afternoon, which is that we have to shift our research attention away from looking at a human body or a university or a seminar and actually understand the relationality, the things which actually comprise those. We have to move away from entities to understand and think about assemblages. We have to move away from the idea of human agency to understand affective movements which interact between humans and humans, but also between humans and non-humans, and even between non-human and non-human. And what that requires us to do is to look not at what bodies are, but what they can do, and to focus not upon the level of structural analysis, trying to understand things in terms of an interaction between a bourgeoisie and a proletariat, but doing a micro-political analysis of what is actually going on within events. I'm going to say one important thing because it comes up later, and that is that in the work that Pam and myself have done, we have taken Deleuze and Guattari's rather complex ideas about territorialization and deterritorialization, about molar and molecular. If you don't know Deleuze and Guattari, well, you can just forget I ever mentioned those words, because what we have tried to make them more sociological in a sense, and we talk about those affects, those forces of one thing upon another, this bottle of water on my thirst, how it affects me when I drink it. Some of these affects in the social world specify capacities. They tend to make certain capacities more possible than others. Other affects actually generalize what we can do, what a body can do. So on one hand, you have a specification process. On the other hand, you have a generalization process. And then there's another movement, which is to understand that some affects tend to aggregate things together. In a sense, by running this seminar today, David, myself, and Peter have actually aggregated you, very disparate people from, who knows where, who've come together and aggregated to produce a seminar. So that is an aggregating affect that we have conducted. However, there are also many affects which actually act quite singularly upon one body. They don't aggregate in that way. It might be that, for again, the example, I drink the water, it acts quite singly upon me. It's not something which is going to aggregate the rest of you together, the fact that I take a drink of water. So those things are important. Specification, generalization, thinking about those affects which aggregate and those which act singularly and may actually disaggregate. So that's the end of the theory. I'm going to move on now. I'm going to suggest that three main criticisms of sociology's approach to social class. The first, I think is pretty obvious from what Peter was saying earlier, and also what I've implied, is that no model of social class to date has actually acknowledged the key part that non-human matter has in the everyday production of social divisions and inequalities. Marx got the closest to it, and I think it's been downhill ever since, frankly. And for Bourdieu, then economic capital is so narrow. It's actually, if you look at the definition, he defines economic capital as those possessions that an individual might readily convert into money. That is an unbelievably narrow definition, much narrower than Marx's definition even of capital. And the rest of what Bourdieu talks about is very much in the realm of symbolic resources rather than material resources. So that's my first criticism, that the interactions that humans have with matter, from the spaces and places that they inhabit, at work, in home, at leisure, the facilities and infrastructure which surround them, have been ignored, and that we actually have to acknowledge those. The second is that contemporary class analysis is essentialist, that what it effectively does is it allocates individual human beings into particular classes and it awards a label to them. Whether you're labeled as social class 1, professional, or if you are labeled by Savage et al. As part of an elite class, or part of a precariat, or part of an emergent middle class, or whatever, it is essentialist. For Bourdieu particularly, this is the case in his conception of capital, that capital is something, it's stuff that can be possessed and owned by an individual. It becomes a personal attribute that members of society possess to a greater or lesser extent. And class position depends upon the total volume of capital possessed by incumbents. So we lose any sense of relationality which might have been existent in Marxist analysis of class. We have something now which is very much down to implying that just as there's an implication that we are of a particular gender or a particular race or a particular sexuality, those ideas have been pretty much blown away. Those ideas that we actually have those fixed categories that we drop into. But when it comes to class, sociology has been very keen to hang on to that. So that loss of relationality is very important. And thirdly, the argument that I've made already to an extent, that what sociology has done is artificially aggregated dissimilar bodies into social class. We've recognized in relationship to gender and race that it's not appropriate to have these very narrow definitions, a binary version of gender, a version of a number of specific races based upon physical characteristics. We need to recognize also the same is the case with class. So let's move on then to think about materialist perspective on social divisions. And I think that these pretty much follow from what I've just said in terms of what we have to think about. We have to understand firstly that social divisions are not down to who you are as an individual, but they're actually based upon the relations that you have in particular contexts. And this requires us to move away from Bourdieu's conception of capital, and I would suggest to the idea of instead of capacities, of thinking about bodies and their capacities, and understand the stratifications and the inequalities which are produced in terms of the capacities which are possible. But it is quite possible for a person in one context to work as a counter assistant in McDonald's or Hungry Jack's, and in another part of life to play the cello and compose music for a professional, semi-professional string quartet, and then another aspect of their life to be a political activist or to be a local councillor. Those capacities emerge in these different contexts. So it is very much the relationality of bodies with other humans and with the non-human which actually produces their class position. The second thing is to argue that we need a micro-political focus rather than a focus upon structure in order to address class. Rather than trying to understand social divisions in terms of creating concepts like patriarchy or neoliberalism or colonialism or hegemonic masculinity, then what we have to explore is we have to explore events, we have to explore people's lives micro-politically at the level of those events, and to understand the specifications and the generalizations which occur, and to also to look very importantly when we're thinking about something like social class at the aggregations which occur, how sometimes we are brought into particular positions and by societal forces, and we are constrained as a consequence of that. In no way am I saying social divisions don't exist. I'm not saying social inequalities don't exist. What I'm saying is that we have to understand how they are produced, and they are produced micro-politically. They're not produced by neoliberalism or patriarchy. And what we need to understand, and what we need to explore, is why some forces are so powerfully aggregative that they do produce those constraints on people's lives. And then the third responding to the third criticism, it is this move away from the idea of focusing upon the symbolic to actually focus upon the interactions that humans have with other humans, but also importantly with non-human matter. We need to explore relational assemblages within which capacities emerge, and to look at the human and non-human interactions which take place. Well, I don't have time. I was going to do a little pre-example to illustrate this in relationship to looking at the micropolitics of academic life. But I don't think I've got time for that. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to move on to the learning to labour study, which is, as I mentioned, is a classic sociological study. And that book which he produced has got the subtitle, How Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs. What Willis did in his work was he looked at, he identified what he considered was a culture clash which was occurring within a school between, on one hand, a academic middle-class system of values which emphasized the importance of education, of getting qualifications, and on the other hand he identified a working class, so-called working class culture in which those values stood for nothing whatsoever, and what was much more important were the values associated with doing manual labor, of earning a living, doing the kinds of work that their parents had done and their parents before them, and rejecting the academic altogether. So Willis identified this clash which was going on with the school, and he actually focused in on a group of working class boys that he called the lads, and they were people who were resisting. It was actually a relatively small group, but he focused in on those. And what he found was that because they were quite resistant to academic values, because they disrupted class, because they sat at the back and did whatever naughty boys do at the age of 14 or 15 to disrupt what the teacher is trying to do at the front of the class, then they were excluded from those classes, and they were progressively shifted to non-academic aspects of the curriculum. They were given opportunities to do more sport, they did manual crafts, they did woodwork or metalwork. This was in the 1970s, so it still had those kinds of titles. I'm sure it's called other things these days. But as a consequence of that, they left school without any qualifications. And as a result, their opportunities in the workforce were quite limited, and they ended up in manual jobs. So this, for Willis, was class reproduction in action. And what he suggested was that this demonstrated how working class kids from working class families get working class jobs. However, I think we have to, when you look at that work dispassionately with the benefit of 40 years in the past, you actually realize that what he's done is he's actually generalized from a very, very small subsample. And he took this group of, I think it was about maybe 8 or 10 lads, and from that he argued that was the general rule about social mobility. There wasn't very much that you could pick up on, but actually there were some examples which ran contrary to that which he included in his data. But I want to come to that, because what I want to do is instead I want to reanalyze that work. And I'm going to do that in 2 steps. Firstly, I want to analyze the whole range of human and non-material relations which were existent within that environment. And I've listed these here. I'm not going to read them all out. You can read them for yourself. But you can see there, this was taken from a close reading of Willis's book, but also having to understand a little bit more about from the educational system. We could actually understand all the different things which were taking place, not only in the school, but also in the wider community, in the families that these children were coming from, and the workplaces that their parents were inhabiting and which they were moving into. So those physical spaces, the tools and the equipment, the raw materials of production, and then the things which were produced out of that, the salaries, the wages which people got for that, and the goods which people were actually able to buy. And these interact in very highly complex ways. And we can see Willis's study is actually very useful, because what it allows us to see is those movements. He didn't call them affective movements, but we can actually understand them in those ways. They are the ways that human and non-human are interacting with each other to affect. First of those is the orientation of the school towards academic achievements. That has very effective impact upon helping children, for some of them to gain qualifications, but for some of them to effectively exclude them from it. The connection between families, jobs, money, and employers, which is something which is going on within that fairly closed community of a Midlands UK town. Looking at some of the material activities and events that the young boys were involved with, around music, around sport, sex, drinking, alcohol, crime. The interactions and the struggles which actually went on within the classrooms, and then also the needs of employers for skilled workers within the town. So all of those things are actually happening, and it is those together interacting which produce these capacities. A lot of that's implicit in Willis's study, but he didn't do that kind of analysis which allowed it to be possible. He limited himself to that very narrow kind of notion of how the symbolic produced, the clash of symbolic values between middle class and working class actually produced social reproduction. What we need to do is we need to think about this slide, by the way, is just one I had to put in because this was I was traveling on a train just around about the time of some royal wedding or other that happened recently, and saw that in southeast London. What we have to understand is the complexity of social divisions. We have to understand that some of those affects, some of those things which I mentioned there in this slide, actually they are very powerfully aggregating, and they do constrain the capacities of otherwise quite dissimilar individuals. However, it also is the case, and I mentioned a moment ago that Willis documents some cases which run against his thesis, and there's two which are nice, which are worth actually describing. There was one of, just trying to see if I can find the name of the boy. There was a there was a boy who actually went to a selective school but was not academic, and he was one of the ones who was actually sort of being pushed out of the academic route. But he had a very strong passion for the game of golf, of all things. The game which is best known as I think the aphorism is, it's the best way known to human beings to spoil a good walk, is the game of golf. He left school at 15, but he actually became a sports professional. And Willis says, this boy is working class, rejects school, but has a total commitment to upward mobility through his chosen sport of golf. So what we can actually see there is an interaction with that very materiality of golf, of the balls and the sticks and the courses and all those things, which actually produced a singular affect which enabled him to move away from that failure route which he was being pushed down as a consequence of not being academic. And then there was another one who was a boy called Larry, who was actually a middle-class boy, but he was actually quite negatively affected by what he perceived as consumer culture around him. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to reject the idea of work, of getting a pension, of buying a house, of buying a car. getting a wife and children. This is a quote from Willis. And however, what he decided he was going to do is he was going to drop out and travel the world, go to India, no doubt, and escape from the system. However, he also decided he was going to try and get really good exam results. So if he kind of at some point in the future actually wanted to come back into the system, then he kept his options open. So these examples suggest the complexity of the social processes that produce stratifications and social inequalities. If we reanalyze Willis's data in terms of material relations, affects, and capacities, we need to acknowledge the range of aggregative effects that do indeed constrain the capacities of young people, but it also reveals the other material relations and their associated affects that fracture those aggregations, producing a range of capacities that open up possibilities for young people. Well, I'm going to conclude now, and really this is just a slide to summarize what I suggest is the way that we need to move forward. We need to move towards a micro-political understanding of affects rather than thinking about these ideas of structures. We need to focus in on capacities which are emergent and context-specific. We need to now generate detailed data on the complex interactions and affect economies which take place in a whole range of different settings which actually produce social divisions and social inequalities. We need to move away from the idea of narrow definitions of people into certain numbers of classes, 7 classes or whatever. We need also to understand the complex affects of non-human matter upon bodies. If we do that, that's going to transform the way that we think about social class. But I think that what it allows us to do is to really start to engage with the important issues about challenging the inequalities and the divisions which exist within society. Thank you. Or comments.
Can I start off then? If it's going on. Yeah, I kind of know the answer to this because I studied this. It's a good example. Education is a good example for me. So, you know, what if we move to the new materialism? What is social change? Social change is so embedded in this kind of thought of agency. What actually happens to?
So my question to Nick and Peter for the recording is: what happens to social change given this move to the new materialisms?
I've got to think. In some ways, it should be I feel like I should be able to come straight up with a response to that. Obviously, it's what my work's really interested in. It's a fundamental question to it. But the other side of it is it's not a straightforward answer. So I could just sort of move sideways for a moment. I've noticed that as Nick and I have been talking, I've said and structural. But what is that? And Nick said not structural. But we're actually making the same point. We're saying, what is that notion of structure in the first instance? And our attentions are directed, I think, to different sort of site or space for where change can be analysed, where it can be thought to exist. Now, I'm not saying that moves outside of a certain trajectory, like feminist trajectory, where the body became the site for change and so on. But I am saying that it's an incredibly entangled, my words, yours, affective. It's just the event or the how we're going to approach that location, I think, is one way I try to word it. That shifts in new materialist language. So I don't want to sort of say, well, what becomes of change in a qualitative sense of what emerges, but I want to say that it is, change becomes the materializing, the entangled, the event, those spaces, which is at once also the site where constraints and norms, things normalise again and again, that reproduction of difference in the most, let's call it negative sense, as much as opening for possibilities. So, yeah, it changed. I mean, where and what is it when we start to talk through a relational ontology that is very much micro, bodily, but body in context, that never excludes a context. And certainly in terms of time, I mean, yeah, it starts to become these usual markers. Our usual language, our vocabulary for social analysis actually starts to get shifted. So with that question of what is change, where is change, or what is change, you know, I think those things all need to be considered in a new materialist approach, or they are pushed forward for consideration in a new materialist approach.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that the examples that I was drawing from Willis's study reflect that micropolitics of the world is such a fluctuating place in this model. There are no structures to then hold it in place. There is, you know, there's nothing bearing down.
Exist that are before or after. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a sense, I mean, I prefer to try to answer the harder question, which is not about how to conceptualize change, but how to conceptualize continuity, because change is relatively easy to conceptualize within this new materialist framework. The criticism which has been offered by many people of new materialism is that it doesn't, because it excludes any notion of structures or systems or mechanisms, it makes it very hard to conceptualize how continuity exists at all. But I think that if you use that very simple idea of aggregation, that helps us to start to understand how continuities are produced, because there are forces. We are living in a world of forces that's all around us. They are physical, biological, they are psychological, they are social, they are cultural, they are emotional. All those forces are actually acting upon us all the time.
Through us, as us, I would add.
Yeah, and producing us. Yeah, you know, we are in a sense just the you know, as you say, the medium whereby those forces you know, operate. What that means is that if you have something which is a very powerful force, which is, for example, you know, we are living at the moment in a system where accumulation of money is important in pretty much every aspect of our lives, so that we are defined by the fact that we cannot afford our $1 million house, or we can afford it. We have to work 35 hours a week in order to get the money to actually be able to pay the mortgage, to do all those sorts of things. And so those kinds of aggregations, they exist. And I mean, they're not things which actually can just be, you know, said, oh, well, we're not going to live under capitalism anymore. You know, actually capitalism is something which is so ingrained, but it's ingrained through events. It is ingrained through every activity that, you know, every time you pay out with your swipe card, you are part of that.
All right, got another question in the back. Is it all right for the recordings? You can hear what you say. It's what I was told to do. So.
My question is about forces and intensities in terms of affective forces. I'm really interested in matter as in not Barad's congealment of agency, but actual matter. I work as an art therapist with pastels and paints, and I work with people who are dying. So matter has a different sort of intensity in that context. What I'm really curious about are your thoughts about transmission. You call it aggregation of affect. I'm really interested in the transmission. I've read Brennan, and I've read Groves after Deleuze, and I've read Probe and Affect Contagion. What are your thoughts about how affect is actually transmitted, if we think about Bennett's force and intensity of matter?
Okay, excellent question. You hear me walking down the stairs on the recording.
Closed captions.
Who wants to go first?
No, it's definitely next question.
Oh, is it? I was thinking that's.
Transmission of affect.
I was thinking that's your kind of thing. No, it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that people get hung up about this word affect, and it's not an easy word because it means different things in different disciplines. Affect doesn't mean emotion. Psychologists talk about affect as meaning emotion, basically. So, an affect is very simple. It is, in Deleuze's term, it is a capacity to affect or be affected by. And we have to use the sciences to understand how different affects work. Because if we put together, let's say that we got a lump of sodium, and we got a tube full of chlorine, and we dropped the sodium into the chlorine, then we would have a huge explosion, and because lots of heat would be generated, and there would be an affective reaction which went on there. But what would be produced out of the end of it would be sodium chloride, which is common salt. So the thing is, we have to understand affect in that context by thinking about the rules of chemistry, and we actually have to understand it at the level of physical chemistry of the electrons whizzing around the sodium and the chlorine atoms. If we're thinking about psychology, a psychological affect, if we think about the interaction between a mother and their newborn infant, then we might wish to draw upon psychological theories in order to understand how the affects work. So I think that what affect is something which is it's a broad term, but actually what it's talking about is something. It's about relationality. And that is I think is the root of understanding transmission of it, to understand that these capacities are in themselves affects. So what an affect will do, let's say that what should we say as an example? What's your field of work? Did you say? Art therapy. So let's say that what you are doing with one of your clients is you are using some kind of artistic activity, and the very simplest thing, you might actually encourage them to paint some pictures or something like that, and there will be an affect there whereby they will affect the paper by their paint strokes. But then, as a consequence of that will actually part of the process of painting that, and part perhaps of the product, will actually be affective again. And so that produces another affect in its turn. And so that then will lead you as the therapist to say to them, well, what do you think, how did that make you feel? Or what is that meaning for you? Or how does that help you with your problem? And then they will engage with that, and that will move forward. And so the transmission is something which is actually going on through the medium there of the language that you use, the medium of the artistic activity, and also the movement of emotions from the past into the present and maybe into the future. I'm saying it is. I'm saying it is pre-personal, because it is not. It is not down to the volition of the individual. It's something which is a movement which is actually operating. It is a force. But the reason for my very long preamble about sodium and chloride and chlorine, all that stuff, was to make the point that affects come in all different shapes and sizes. So it's not just about saying that something which is about emotion or about thinking or whatever. It can be all of those things, and they can happen in all sorts of different ways. And let's say that there's a news item on the TV about a sex offender, and that news item then leads someone to go out and try and hunt down this sex offender in their neighborhood and, you know, attack them or whatever. And as a consequence of that, they are then arrested and they're put in prison. So the whole continuity of affect which is going through. So something like, you know, we never know where affect is going to take us. That's the interesting thing about it. But it flows through multiple modalities.
Can I just add something quickly to that? And this is just a brief sort of thought as Nick was talking. From your question, there's a certain temporality to transmission when it's conceived in, you know, that sort of the sense of one thing leads to another thing. There's a certain linearity to it and so on. And I really liked Nick's statement, it's there. And transmission, in a sense, is, let's say, always present, always possible, you could put it, yeah? And should we actually rely on that temporal sort of assumption contained in that notion of transmission? Or can we think through this lens of which direction, where, you know, these sort of affective flows? Or, yeah, I just wanted to add that to it. And just to say that I understand that you're working through a different trajectory to one that's straightforwardly Baradian or something closer to what she's doing. But nevertheless, even in that notion of the apparatus, I can hear this idea of the event, even in the idea of, well, I'll use the word practices instead of using the word affect or affective. So I think there's still a very similar response or way towards your question through Barad's work as well.
Yes. That's good.
So, hi, I'm in this stage of my PhD where I've done all my field work and am now just thinking like, there's this whole material aspect to what's happened in my like sociological sort of empirical project, which is making me rethink actually what like the empirical project is. And it's now I'm going back having to assemble what I thought I was trying to find out and figure out, well, how do I actually now look at a post-human, you know, new material sort of analysis of this? And is it going to be rigorous still? Like, I'm just kind of like, there's like an anxiety there around making sure I can still kind of say something rigorous and, you know, redefine what like the empirical project is basically. It's not really a question. It's more of just like,
Thanks. I mean, I think that's really important. And can I ask? I mean, you've had some kind of, you know, enlightenment experience, have you?
I have. So my research is on social media, experiences of gender and religion online. But actually what I found is that algorithms, a smartphone, are having real material discursive impacts on the human, and what it means to be human, that I'm trying to now go back and negotiate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, this is a real challenge. I think that, I mean, my words to you would be encouraging that, well, there's two things here. I mean, the question, can it be rigorous? And the answer is absolutely yes, to the extent that any sociology can be rigorous. I mean, we are a theory-led discipline, and so the theoretical tools that we use are extremely important in leading us to an understanding of our data. And it is quite conceivable that one would take the same data and with a different theoretical perspective, you would come up with very different findings from it. You know, same data, different theory would lead you to different things. I've done it myself, you know, my own PhD. I actually did an analysis. My PhD was on surgery, and I did a really straightforward, you know, kind of interactionist analysis. This was a long time ago, so that was kind of trendy at the time. But then I had a girlfriend who was a post-structuralist, and she converted me. And so I then thought, oh, I got to reanalyze my data. And I actually wrote a book out of it, but had to completely reanalyze the data. But I actually think with the new theoretical framework, it was better than the old one. I mean, I think that, you know, you should be reassured that your enlightenment moments has actually led you to see something that is not previously possible for you to see in the data. And that's the important thing, is that new materialism does offer you that, and the post-human perspective does offer means to see different things. It doesn't have the answer to everything. It's not kind of the magic bullet which sociology has been looking for 150 years. What it is a new set of concepts, new toolkit which we can use. These toolkits of assemblages and affects, the more than human, these kinds of concepts. What it allows us to do is to say different things about our data. I mean, Barad goes the furthest with that, with I think her notion of diffraction. I don't know, you might like to talk about diffraction in a moment. But I mean, the other thing, there is a slight warning here, and the warning is that sometimes when you collect data, it may not be the right data for collecting for a new materialist analysis, and that's the risk. Is that, you know, you've actually got a load of data which is not going to be very useful to you. I mean, I'll very quickly tell you that the reason that I'm talking to you here today about class is because I met somebody at a conference, the TASA conference in November, who's doing work on social class in Russia. And I got talking to her and said, oh, that sounds like really interesting. I've been thinking about new materialism in class. And she said, oh, yeah, that's really interesting. So I was kind of talking a bit about that. And she would love to reanalyze her data from the new materialist perspective. But the trouble is, looking at the data, she's collected a lot of data which really doesn't address the kinds of things that a new materialist might be interested in, which is much more upon the non-human and the more than human. So I think that's the danger. But it sounds to me as if, like, you know, you hopefully will have the right kind of data for it to allow you to do that. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you. Okay. I'm not going to counter exactly what you've said, but I do want to just qualify something. The way I would respond, first of all, around that question of what your correct data is. I think it's difficult to determine what the correct data is. As you say, it's an analytical apparatus, I'll call it the apparatus, through which certain things come alive in that understanding and that rendering of what it is you're trying to understand. That, you know, that post-humanist performative sort of perspective is going to raise. So there's definitely something around that whole sort of shift in what your methodology is, as well as how you're going to address a question of methodology that you're obviously grappling with and is going to have to come into your discussions. And great to mention diffractive reading, for example, as a practice of analysis. That is one that's very much, I'm trying to say, it's not trying to tell me what my correct data should be or what it's better sort of oriented towards analysing. What it is going to be is it's a method that is bringing to light different elements of the material that you otherwise may not have walked into with more preconceived ideas, codings, categorizations, conceptual frameworks, and so on. So Lisa Matsai is actually a fantastic researcher who has a great discussion on doing diffractive analysis of her ethnographic data. And she actually describes that process of diffractive reading very, very well. So she gives you, if you want to, you're looking for rigor, she gives you something quite substantial to this is how it's done, and this is how she does it, and this is what she found. And I can't remember exactly the essay off the top of my head because I've read a bunch of stuff by her. I'm really impressed with her work. Diffractive reading, though, as a methodology or a method is something that won't start, like the whole framework we've been talking, it doesn't start with something fixed, doesn't start with what's known. It's a different method. It's called the reading things through each other, of allowing certain interruptions, of now trying this, let's say, try this different reconfiguring of how we're putting that data together, or maybe I'm going to take that and read it across this. It's sort of that idea of transversing through the data to see what else might emerge. The other thing I was just thinking of to help you again around that question of rigor is Utrecht. I was teaching at Utrecht for a number of years just recently, and there was a fantastic reworking of Octavia Butler's text around human technology relationships that was done into an art installation there. And again, just it's a place that we've frequented a lot, but it doesn't come to mind immediately, where the analyses that we did of it and that the students were doing with me of it was they were, again, that idea of this is your material around technology, mediation, bodies, you know, as context and so on, where it's directly applied through a particular form of analysis in the way of those art installations. And I'll pass that along to you just so you can see the essay and just see how it's discussed there, and it might give you some sort of touchstone around how research has been done in a very, very similar field using these broader or these new materialist frameworks for understanding. Yeah. So that would be my contribution to the question, and I do wish you luck with that whole idea of the methodological shifts that emerge, and therefore, yeah. But rigour, I think, through a diffractive reading is something that emerges as the practice of that reading, and that's why Matsai will give you some real, something not sort of, yeah, really clear to think with around that, the way you're conducting the analysis. Okay.
Any more questions? We've still got 10 minutes, or we can wrap it up there and say thank you to our guests today. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nick and Peter. And thank you all for coming.
Could I just say thanks to David for organising this, and to Elise as well, who's done great work sorting out the technology for us. But thanks to all of you for coming. It's been brilliant.
And I wish I knew where the recording's gone, but it would be interesting to see it. I have to work that out now. Yeah. So, somewhere on the internet, the whole thing is recorded. Thank you. Oh, no, there's actually 4 people.
So I've been doing yes, I think I've got to do it. And as you mentioned, your horror of London discussion, I'll mention mine because it just happened this year. And that was terrible.
I'll tell you what happened to me in 2011. I went and had lunch with Jessica at the British Museum, actually, and I left Jessica and I had a talk at Goldsmiths at 5 o'clock. I left Jessica about 1:30ish. Got the tube down to Liverpool Street. One more stop to get the tube over the river to cross.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
And then there was an announcement came after an hour or something. And I was saying, and then there was suicide. Yeah. Another hour. And then she got a cab. And now it's 4 o'clock. Get out of the Liverpool Street area, okay? And then when, you know what's going on.
Yes, I do.
Right across the river. And then you know the road that goes to business. It's great. All on the street. It's like a road on the street. It's a quickly straight line. And at the end of it is Goldsmiths. So at that point, yeah. Now it was about 5 o'clock. And I didn't, it was a bit like this, I didn't know. It was just all about a whole friend of mine signing a song in 2019. That's what I was doing. Didn't know how many people would turn up. It was part of the visual cultures. So I did the first lecture.
Okay, I want to do something for that.
Yeah. So I just, so I ran the taxi. I ran. It took about 20 minutes. I got half an hour late. Couldn't find the room. Eventually found it. Came in, opened the door. All waiting for our guest from Australia. I was and my paper was a new kind of material for those who were reading the traffic jam.
Seriously? That's fantastic. My problem, I never ended up giving up. First of all, and I get lots of extra
Yeah.
Ryan, that's my business. Ryan, when you go online, you have to do your online. You have to I was even going to say that I got online, and I said that's why I'm here. And I looked at it, how much time? No. So that was all very stressful. That's okay, so we're looking at trying to shuffle it. Well, I love I've done practice on the I didn't end up being able to do that much time to say this is my opportunity to speak on gender and PhD, education, people on that, and I was so frustrating and so stressful for me. So I'm lucky that you went to that.
I don't mean it was all okay.
But then you, I would have
yeah.
and I said to Jessica, I'm going to go to the hotel, and I really did not consider it.
It was all right. The other speakers, it was Mark Fisher and Ian Powell.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's nice. That's nice. Oh, no,
2004.
okay, I thought it was even bigger.
I was at work studying attribution. Never met. I was always over in philosophy. Yeah. Sorry, Lisa. It's all finished. Yeah, no, everything's all done. Everything's all done. That I don't know. So, can we see what happened anywhere? Or do we have to go to the link that you sent with that?
It's still on. Here it goes.
I haven't touched it. I just minimalised
Stop
it.
there. So now I should hopefully get sent a link,
Yeah.
and it should have the recording.
Okay, so you can send that to us and we'll